Alrighty, so we're going to now turn from describing poverty in the United States and the ways in which it varies from place to place and group to group and person to person, and thinking about what it means to be poor and measuring that. And we're going to turn now from describing poverty in the United States and looking at the ways in which it varies from place to place and from group to group, and to thinking about what it means to be poor and how we measure it. We're going to turn now to trying to explain why it is that people are income poor in the first place and why it varies in the way that it does. Now, there's a common kind of argument that you'll hear about how people can avoid being poor, and one version of it is linked to in the slide here. And this argument suggests, with some variation, that people can avoid being poor if they will simply stay in school and graduate, and ideally go on to college, get and keep a job, get married and stay married, and not have children unless they have a spouse. This is, at some level, especially given what you now know about how poverty varies from group to group, it's one of those arguments that sounds perfectly plausible and sensible, maybe. But these turn out to be things that are much easier said than done. And that's what we're going to start exploring in this lecture, beginning by looking at employment. Now, first thing to note is, and we've seen this before, the overwhelming majority of all people who are poor are children, the elderly, disabled students, or are themselves working. The share of poor people who are able-bodied working-age adults is in fact relatively small. But let's start homing in on this question of work and its relationship to poverty, right? So since we're talking about the labor market population, we're going to exclude from our discussion children under the age of 18 and people over the age of 65 for now. So we're looking at just working age adults, right? And we've got two groups that we need to think about in this context. First, there are the poor adults who do not work at all over the course of the year, and that's 60% or so of all poor adults. And for them, we need to explain why don't they work? And then we need to explain the other 40%. Why is it that of those adults who do work, they are nonetheless poor? And remember, most of the income from those at the bottom comes from work. We'll return in a second to why those people are still poor. But I want to start by talking about why it is that there are working age adults who don't work. And one of the answers here, and we made reference to this earlier, is disability. People in the United States with physical or mental disabilities are much less likely to participate in the labor market and are much more likely to have much higher unemployment rates. You can see here, and this is a place where it might be worth pausing and looking, this is pretty common for poor Americans, especially in periods of tight labor markets, that is, when jobs are scarce. People with disabilities may have an especially hard time finding a job. The American labor market simply doesn't do a good job of adapting to people's needs. Now, you'll remember, you saw earlier in the course that few poor people are consistently poor over a 3-year period, right? Or a 4-year period. Maybe 3% of the population is persistently poor. About 2/3 of that group have at least one disability, right? So a lot of that persistent poverty is, in fact, about disability. So disability of one kind or another may account for as much as half of all the failure to work among poor adults, right? So what about the rest? Why are they not working? The short answer is that even in so-called normal times, in non-recessionary times, there aren't enough jobs for everyone who wants one, right? And in more recent years, that problem has been particularly acute. So this is the official unemployment rate since about the mid-1940s, and you can see lots of fluctuation over time here. I noticed that the two worst periods recently were the early 1980s and the Great Recession that we just got out of, the worst October 2009, when at its worst, fully 10% of all adults were out of work and couldn't find a job. Now, just as the official poverty measure, as we've talked about, has some pretty profound flaws that affect the usefulness of that measure, so too does the official measure of unemployment, often called the U3. It has its own methodological problems, and among them, it doesn't count as unemployed people who have been unemployed for so long that they've given up looking for work. And it doesn't include people who are working in part-time jobs but need or want full-time work. This is so-called underemployed. So when we factor these groups in, the people who have been out of work for so long that they're not even looking for work anymore, and the people who are working, but they're working a part-time job and they need a full-time job, when we factor those two groups in, and that's the red line here in what's called the U6 measure, we can see that unemployment is actually even higher than we think, and in the recent recession, it actually peaked at 17%. But even that U6 is an indicator of limited usefulness. It tells us how many people there are looking for work and therefore competing for the jobs are available. But it doesn't tell us how many jobs are available. And recently, it's not unusual for there to be 3 job seekers for every job opening. And even now, it's down to about 1.5 job seekers for each job, as you can see here. But just as important, the unemployment rates don't tell us what field job openings are in either. I mean, after all, if you're looking for work and you have 20 years experience as an administrative assistant in a law firm, there were lots of job openings up in nursing or in engineering, well, that wouldn't really matter to you, right? So you see here that it's not just that unemployment has been historically high, but that the odds are overwhelmingly against you in some industries. So look at the construction industry here, for example, an area that was hardest hit by the recent recession because of the collapse of the housing market. Compare the number of unemployed construction workers with the number of construction jobs. Now, people will often complain that unemployed people are simply not trying hard enough. But it doesn't matter how hard you work, how many resumes you send out, how carefully you prepare for interviews, how diligent you are about networking and following up on leads. The overwhelming majority of construction workers who look for work will not find it because there are not enough jobs for all of them to get a job. Not even enough for half of them to get work, or for a third of them, or for a fifth of them. Now, as you might expect, unemployment rates vary not just by industry, but by race. So much so that in the 1960s, African American unemployment was about twice the rate as it was for whites. Now, 50 years later, after the victories of the civil rights movement, black unemployment is still about twice the rate as it is for whites. And we will do a little bit of work to try to make sense of that in coming sessions. But for now, know that it is always a recession for large numbers of African Americans, and during periods of overall recession, it's typically a depression in black communities. Finally, it's not just that there are not enough jobs for everyone who wants one, and that as a result, the unemployment is still very high, but that people are experiencing unemployment for longer periods of time. So this chart shows the number of unemployed people who have been without a job for 27 weeks or more, half a year. As you can see, this long-term unemployment, which is especially destructive for families, has been at record levels. There's one other measure that may be useful here, and this is the share of all working age adults who are actually working. And there are a lot of economists who argue that we should be looking at this instead of those unemployment measures. But notice also that this measure hasn't recovered either. Part of what's going on here is that this current recovery was worse than any in the post-war period in terms of jobs lost, and is proceeding more slowly than any other ever has. It's been an especially bad time in U.S. history to be without work, although, as we'll see next, it's not necessarily any bed of roses for working people either. So these data suggest, it seems to me, that the best way to explain why people don't work is not to point to their supposed laziness or their bad behavior, but rather to point to larger economic forces beyond an individual's control. Indeed, this maybe is the central divide in explaining why people are poor, right? Is it primarily behavioral or is it structural? I think the evidence says clearly that it's the latter. Now, not being able to find a job or physical or mental disability are not the only reasons adults don't work or don't work more. Many can't because they have children they've got to care for. And the laws of physics tells us that you cannot be simultaneously at home caring for your children and at work providing the economic means for that care. You could pay someone to care for your children, of course, but that's expensive, as many of you likely know firsthand, and it is significantly more expensive in some places than it is in others. And unlike other rich democracies, there's not a lot the United States government does to help solve this childcare dilemma. We have no mandatory paid parental leave policies and no universal daycare program. So this is why some cities' recent efforts to institute universal free pre-K programs is not just good education policy, it's good employment policy too. Many more women would work if they could be certain that their children were safely taken care of and they could afford that care. And I say women advisedly, since we still live in a culture in which women do the overwhelming majority of all care work, including caring for children, for the sick, for the disabled, and for the elderly, and they perform the majority of all household labor too, even as they are more and more likely to be, even as they are more and more likely to be found working outside the home as well. So, that's a little bit about why poor adults don't work or why they don't work more. Now, are there people who are able to work but unwilling to, content to get by on whatever social welfare benefits they can receive? Sure there are. But there aren't many. The overwhelming weight of social science research points in the same direction. People want to work, but face formidable obstacles that make it hard or impossible for them to do so. So, what about the other 40% of poor adults, those who are working but are still poor? So here's a crisp overview of what it is that we're talking about. So why don't you take a moment here and just look through this. All right, so why are working people poor? For many, it's because they don't get paid enough. You can see that here. So this shows the share of workers over time earning poverty-level wages. Now, poverty-level wage is this. Take your hourly rate, multiply it by 40 hours a week, and then by 52 weeks a year. Would you be poor on that annual income by official poverty measure standards? That's the poverty level wage. So in 2013, 28% of all workers and almost a third of all women workers earned poverty level wages. So even if they worked full time all year round, they'd still be poor. Now, it's worse for people of color, as you should now expect, with 42% of Hispanic workers and 36% of African American workers earning poverty-level wages. And it's been getting worse over the past decades, with more and more U.S. workers earning poverty wages, or as we see here, low wages at or below 2/3 of median income. That's about $24,000 for an individual. This, once again, makes the United States an anomaly. We have many, many more workers in low-wage work than do lots of other rich democracies. There's a pretty clear correlation between the number of low-wage workers and the poverty rate across rich democracies, as you can see. And men still make more than women, who get some 80 cents on the dollar for what a man doing the same job would get. But those low wages getting worse over the last 30, 40 years are not because workers' productivity has declined. It's just that sometime in the 1970s, workers stopped reaping the benefits of productivity and their wages and benefits stagnated. Women's wages have at least been rising, but look at that bottom line. And that's a big part of the story here, the stagnation of men's wages. Indeed, that's men's declining wages. That's part of why the male-female wage gap has been declining. We should note yet again the variation here by race. and by education, right? Those wage declines have been especially dramatic among less educated workers. The very people social workers are likely to be serving, right? It used to be, if you look at the mid-20th century, that if you were a white man in the North, you could graduate high school, walk down the road to the GM plant where your dad worked, and there'd be a job waiting for you. Be a union job with good wages, good job security, good benefits, regular vacation time, and that job would make it possible for you to support a family, put your kids through school, and buy a house. By and large, those jobs simply don't exist anymore. And if you are a less educated man, and especially a less educated man of color, the odds of finding a good job that would do all of those things for you get slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. Now, part of why wages have stagnated is that government does less to push them up. Now, look at that bottom line here. That's the value of the federal minimum wage controlling for inflation. So even with a projected increase from today's rate, it will still be lower than it was in 1968. Now, what those other lines show, moving up the chart, is what the minimum wage would be if it had kept pace with average wages, right? Real just means controlling for inflation here, or with productivity. By contrast, if the minimum wage had kept pace with wage growth for the top 1%, it'd be almost $30 an hour today. But this is part of why working people's wages are so low, and in turn, why they are so poor. So this is some data on where I live and work. Right, this is the gap between how much money you need to earn for a single parent and one child and what the minimum wage is. Right, that in red is the gap. Now, contrary to some conventional wisdom, minimum wage workers are not mostly kids working summer jobs. So here's what a typical minimum wage worker looks like. It's an older white woman with children trying to support her family. Now, there are some policy solutions to this, right? The Earned Income Tax Credit would raise the value of work for low-wage workers, would increase income and increase the number of hours that people work, for example, right? So it's not as if it's hopeless, but that then becomes the political challenge to enact those kinds of policy changes. But here's, I think, that larger lesson and what I think of as a good response to arguments that people are poor because they're lazy. And this is as it was in 1791. Right? It is said that our poor are indolent and will not work, but give the poor a sufficient compensation for their work. Let the demand for their exertions be constant and steady, and it will soon be found that the charge of indolence is a calumny on the most destitute part of our fellow citizens. Same as it ever was. But now this still begs the question, right? Why have wages declined, and why has the minimum wage failed to keep up? It's a more complicated question than we're going to address right here, but let me offer one important part of the answer, and that's the declining share of the U.S. labor force that belongs to a union. Here's one of the effects, and another. In short, if you belong to a union, you've got some leverage against your employer and you can get a better deal on wages and benefits. One person alone threatening to quit has no power. But all the workers threatening to quit or slow down operations or shut down the plant can have extraordinary power and force the employer to the bargaining table. Unionization rates correlate with mobility. United States with higher union membership have more upward mobility. And countries with higher union density rates, more people belonging to unions, have lower rates of poverty. Women especially benefit from union protection, and you don't see that in this chart, but women of color even more so benefit from union protection, and that's in part because unions make it much harder to discriminate on the basis not just of gender but on race. Don't make it impossible, but they make it harder. So once again, right, this pattern marks us as an outlier among rich democracies and is a piece of the larger puzzle.